There's this tendency in social science and in the media to talk a lot about political polarization and how bad it is and how it is tearing us apart, to treat it as some sort of ultimate evil that destroys democracies. Now, this video is not going to be about how polarization is good or how it's good for democracy. It definitely isn't. It is going to be about how thinking in terms of polarization may be clouding our eyes to our political reality. One major issue with thinking in terms of polarization is that it treats distance from the political center as bad without paying attention to the substance of that distance. Both universal health care and banning all abortions are radical positions in the American context and could be viewed as contributing to polarization. But simply talking in terms of polarization ignores what the supposed polarized positions actually are. I think in both academia and media, people like to talk about polarization because they get to present themselves as neutral and unbiased. However, a bias towards the middle is still a bias. When talking about polarization and blaming both sides, you get to seem like the adult in the room. It also seems to be pretty good for getting grant money and book deals. I especially understand it from social science because in social science, the right answer is often in the middle. Like, are we shaped by nurture or nature? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. The issue with this way of thinking is that it assumes both sides are sensible and taking some sort of scientific or basically logical approach. And politics doesn't consist of reasoned scientific approaches and polite disagreement. I never claim to be unbiased on this channel. Instead, I try to be transparent about what my bias is because I feel like that is my best and most honest option. So I will fully admit that I am left leaning and a registered Democrat. And while I am critical of the Democratic Party, I am primarily critical of it from its left flank. However, in this video, I'm not going to try and persuade you to left leaning or Democratic positions. Instead, I'm going to try and focus on why thinking in terms of both sides, in terms of polarization, is a flawed way of thinking about politics. I am also going to try and lean on objective evidence as much as possible. To my more leftist viewers, you aren't really the problem here, but you will probably still like the video and find it useful because you could show it to your more middle of the road friends and family to show them why you are not the same thing as the extreme right. Hello, moderates being asked to watch this by the leftists in your life. Thanks for tuning in. Leftists, give your moderate friends a cookie to eat as they watch. People are often more easily persuaded when you are nice to them, and I think this video would pair well with a cookie. Welcome, or welcome back to Political-psych-abby, the channel where I would give you all a cookie if I could, and where I need to stop writing my jokes just before lunch. If you want more from me, including occasionally pictures of cookies, subscribe and follow my social media, links in the description. I'm going to focus in this video on the perils of what I'll call political both-sidesism. This builds off the idea of journalistic both-sidesism, which is the idea that both sides of an issue always deserve equal time. In a political context, I'm using both-sidesism to mean the idea that issues within our political system arise from polarization and division rather than from specific political tendencies and responses to substantive issues. Before we get started, I want to say that I will be primarily focusing on this in the context of Democrats/liberals versus Republicans/conservatives in the United States, because it is where I have seen this issue of both sidesism most prevalently and is the context I am most familiar with. If you are from another country where the parties are arrayed along a left-right spectrum, this might carry over, especially if you have only two major parties. I also want to say that I'll be using liberals to refer to left of center and conservatives to refer to the right of that, because that is what the literature tends to do. Please address your critiques of calling leftist liberals to the political science and psychology establishments, not to me. The first thing I want to talk about is our understanding of reality. There's a lot of research about how partisan bias can distort our understanding of facts and information. This is absolutely not something that the left half of the American political spectrum is immune to. Under experimental conditions, it is common to find Democrats and Republicans falling for misinformation fairly equally. Though the studies that do find a difference by party membership tend to show Republicans being more susceptible. There are multiple possible causes for this, including psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, since conservatives typically have more need for cognitive closure, are more dogmatic, and have lower levels of self reflection. However, that explanation for the discrepancy is currently being heavily questioned in the field. Actually, this is a pretty good example of a thing where the likely correct answer actually is in the middle. There's a good chance that psychological factors matter here, but they don't explain the whole difference, probably. A big possible explanation may be that Republicans are actually more likely to be exposed to more fake news, especially fake news that supports their own views. Well, the causes of false beliefs are fascinating and important. This video will be more concerned with who believes what and the consequences of those beliefs. One study I found especially interesting by Ombudsman et al. Found that the most polarized Democrats and Republicans shared more misinformation on Twitter, but that Republicans did this far more than Democrats. The authors suggest that this is because partisans want to share news that favors their side, but Democrats do not have to resort to sharing fake news in order to do that, at least not as often as Republicans. They do not go as far as to say that reality has a left leaning bias, but I might be willing to say that. Interestingly, they do not choose to highlight any of the multiple significant differences by party they found in their abstract. This might be because they want to focus more on cognitive mechanisms, but it might also be an artifact of the hesitance some social scientists have to highlight partisan differences, and especially things that make the right specifically look bad. I do want to clarify, though, that my intention is not really to critique this specific article or even what they choose to include in their abstract. Generally, it's a really good article. I just thought that it was an example of what social scientists tend to highlight in research on this topic. Honestly, this article is bolder in its approach to acknowledging differences in Republicans and Democrats' behavior than most. It's a low bar. Another thing I like about the Osmondson et al. Study is that it is observing real world conditions rather than artificial experimental ones. Now, I love a good experiment. I literally teach people how to do them as part of my day job. They're great if you want to understand psychological constructs and if you want to be able to draw conclusions about causation. However, experiments where the misinformation being shown to people has been selected and shaped artificially may not be the best way to examine this issue. If your wacky uncle at Thanksgiving is getting most of his misinformation as stimuli in scientific studies, someone has really messed up their debrief and needs to go before the ethics board. I tried to find research on overall levels of belief in misinformation among Democrats and Republicans, but that can be tough because there are literally an infinite number of incorrect beliefs people could have. Also, studies in this field do not usually include the level of consequences of misinformation beliefs in their analysis, which is admittedly very hard to do, at least objectively. Still, I don't really care if someone believes in Bigfoot as long as it doesn't affect any of their actions. So, I'm going to talk about what I conceptualize as the most common and consequential false beliefs in America at the moment. This list is based on looking at various polling data and observing news events, but unfortunately, I could not find a way to make it truly objective. If you think I missed something important, please tell me. I do want to mention two important thresholds I set for myself in selecting these false beliefs. The first is that belief has to be objectively wrong, not like a matter of opinion. And secondly, the belief has to have gotten people killed. First, I want to talk about election denial. The percentage of Republicans who think the 2020 election was stolen has varied somewhat over the last 3 years, but has been as high as 72%, which qualifies it as a majority position within the party. And of course, many Republican politicians and organizations have also engaged in election denial. It is, of course, worth mentioning that a poll by YouGov in 2016 found that 50% of Clinton voters thought that Russia had interfered with vote totals in favor of Trump, which is also false. However, there was some level of Russian interference in the 2016 election, so it's not totally nuts for Clinton supporters to think this, especially so close to the election. However, to me at least, what is more compelling evidence for a difference between Republicans and Democrats Then the differences in percentages or how far from reality the claim is that Democrats did not storm the Capitol or try to overturn the election. As far as I can determine, no one died because Democrats overestimated Russian interference, unlike Republican denial of the 2020 election. False beliefs about Russian interference are still bad and likely represent partisan bias, but they should not be considered the equivalent of denial of the 2020 election. Related to election denial, I should probably mention QAnon beliefs, as the movement seems deeply intertwined with election denial, especially around the storming of the Capitol. For those who are blissfully and enviably ignorant of QAnon, it is a series of interlocking right-wing conspiracy theories that started on 4chan. The Public Religion Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that does polls focused on religion and politics, identify 3 core QAnon beliefs. 1. The government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. I think the Satan worship aspect is probably why a research org focused on religion got involved. 2. There is a storm coming that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. And 3, because things have gone so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. I don't think the algorithm's going to listen to this, but I am not peddling these beliefs. I am debunking them. PRI classifies 16% of Americans as QAnon believers in that they completely or mostly agree with most or all of these statements. 43% of those are Republicans and 27% are independents. Smaller shares are Democrats and other political party affiliations. If we look at instead people who self-ID as QAnon believers, the partisan difference is starker. 1 in 4 Republicans, 25%, compared to 14% of independents and 9% of Democrats. While QAnon is not an exclusively Republican movement, QAnon believers tend to prefer the Republican Party, and 69% of QAnon believers agree with the statement the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. In addition to the storming of the Capitol and overlaps with vaccine refusal, which we're getting to next, QAnon beliefs have gotten people killed in other ways. I'm not going to go into the horrifying details, but multiple QAnon adherents have murdered their family members, including children, in ways that seem, at the very least, influenced by their QAnon beliefs. Now on to false beliefs about vaccines, which do seem to overlap with QAnon beliefs a bit, but also seem even more common. Republicans are more likely to believe vaccine misinformation and to not get vaccinated. Olson and Palm found that in summer 2021, 52% of Republicans said that they had received at least 1 dose of the vaccine or planned to get vaccinated as soon as possible, as opposed to 88% of Democrats. Further evidence of this division is the fact that 17 of the 20 states with the lowest vaccination rates in the summer of 2021 were carried by Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. And yes, this has gotten people, especially Republicans, killed. To quote a study by Wallace, Goldsmith, Pinkman, and Schwartz, in a cohort study evaluating over 500,000 deaths in individuals aged 25 years or older in Florida and Ohio between March 2020 and December 2021, excess mortality was significantly higher for Republican voters than Democratic voters after COVID vaccines were available to all adults, but not before. So, yeah, being a Republican is a likely health risk factor for yourself and those around you. As much as I might not like Republicans, I absolutely do not want anyone to die a preventable death. Does this mean I care more about the lives of Republicans than their own leaders? Well, maybe. I think people overestimate the degree to which Republican leaders are Machiavellian geniuses instead of true believers in bad ideology or outright falsehoods. Speaking of outright falsehoods, let's talk about climate change denial. According to a 2023 Gallup poll, 88% of Democrats and 66% of independents and 29% of Republicans mainly attributed the rise in Earth's temperature over the past century to pollution from human activities. What is perhaps even worse than the discrepancy in people who believe in climate change between parties is what happened during the first Republican primary presidential debate for 2024. The moderator asked, "Do you believe human behavior is causing climate change? Raise your hand if you do." and not one candidate did. Now, Donald Trump was not on that stage, but he is at the very least a climate change skeptic and made numerous catastrophic environmental decisions as president. Now, I have met Republicans and former Republicans who care deeply about climate change, and I'm very open to working with them on this issue. But they are hardly the majority, and these climate minded Republicans seem not to currently find their own party very friendly to climate action. It can be hard to attribute specific deaths to climate change alone because things like extreme weather occur even without climate change, but climate change makes them occur far, far more frequently. About 5 million deaths a year can be attributed to abnormal temperatures alone, and abnormal temperatures are not the only effect of climate change. I am not going to say that the Democrats are great on climate change because I try not to lie to my audience. But the Republican Party is considerably worse because the Democrats at least acknowledge that climate change is real. So, yeah, it's hardly a both sides are too extreme issue. It's more of a neither side takes the issue seriously enough, but only one side even acknowledges the problem issue. You know, like an alcoholic who keeps relapsing versus one who has yet to acknowledge they are an alcoholic. Except in this instance, the alcohol is oil. I do want to have a brief digression here to say that it's difficult to impossible to know what people believe deep down. So, possibly some people are expressing ideologically convenient false beliefs they do not actually hold deep down. This is an interesting possibility, but if it were true, it does not get anyone off the hook. This is more of a question of whether denial of reality is performative or genuine than about whether it matters. It matters and has grave consequences either way. Basically, my point here is that a lot of the time, politics is not two sides that are too extreme. It is one side that is willfully or accidentally out of touch with objective reality, and one side that is flawed in how it deals with reality. And in America, usually the Republicans are the former and the Democrats are the latter. So it is unreasonable to treat them as both too extreme, and it's especially unreasonable to treat those to the left of mainstream Democrats as equally out of touch with reality as those to the right of mainstream Republicans. Weirdly, this still comes into play when it comes to how the different sides view prejudice. Basically, they disagree over who experiences more prejudice. Side note here, this video will be treating as a given the idea that prejudice is bad, and so is depriving people of their rights. This is for two reasons. The first is time constraints. The second is that my goal here is to persuade moderates that the left of them is more sensible than the right of them, not to persuade right-wing extremists leftwards. That's a more intense task for another day. To quote the Wall Street Journal about the findings of their own poll, more than 80% of Democrats say that Black, gay, and Jewish people face prejudice, while a majority of Republicans say discrimination is more often aimed at white people and Christians. I was going to find a source to refute the idea that white people and Christians face significant prejudice in this country, but then my editor, who is a white man and to a certain extent Christian, said it would be wrong to overly dignify a patently false claim, which is also an offensive claim. So instead, I will direct you to the quotes from people who hold this view in the Wall Street Journal article, where you can judge the silliness of this view for yourself. Unfortunately, there are also some political psychologists who put forward the idea that Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, are equally or close to equally prejudiced, just against different groups, and that who those groups are is dependent on which groups they find ideologically dissimilar and or threatening. This is commonly called the ideological conflict hypothesis. I do think it is interesting and important to talk about prejudice that doesn't stem from the right. However, I do want to express two important criticisms of this idea. So, I want you to look at this graph from Brandt et al., one of the most influential articles pushing this view. I want you to think about which groups experience more prejudice from liberals and which from conservatives. You might notice that there are more groups disliked more by conservatives, but honestly, that's not my main point, because that could be an artifact of which groups were chosen for the study. The first major point I want to make is that more groups that you do not willingly choose to enter are on the more disliked by conservative side. This is especially true of historically marginalized groups. These groups include things like gays and lesbians, Black people, Hispanics, and young people. There are also some involuntarily joined groups on the disliked more by liberal side, like elderly people, whites, and men. We as a society definitely do not treat the elderly well enough, although it's not like conservative policies are helping that very much. Regarding white men, well, affirmative action exists, but does not play as big a role in hiring decisions and stuff as many people think it does. It's also not allowed anymore in a lot of situations. Whether it even actually hurts white men is at the very least controversial. Even if it does not really meet a lot of the definitions of prejudice, given that it's designed to counter other forms of prejudice. Plus, getting slightly less of a leg up on applications, while possibly getting a leg up less officially due to prejudice against groups you're not a part of, should not be likened to being at a higher risk of hate crimes or being deprived of your rights. Also, a lot of the people who complain about prejudice against white men or Christians are actually complaining that they are being looked down on for being racist or sexist or homophobic, etc., at least in my experience. In other words, a lot of these people don't have some sort of nuanced policy critique of affirmative action. They want to be able to say the N word. That is not to say that you should hate someone for being white or for being a man or for being Christian, although there's some caveats with that. And there are actual societal things that make men specifically suffer. But they are not down to prejudice by liberals, they are down to patriarchy. Watch my video on the psychology of sexism for more on that. Even for groups you can voluntarily move between on here, ones that are harder to leave are often disliked more by conservatives. For example, it's way easier to stop being rich than it is to stop being poor. The other main point I would like to make here is which voluntarily joined political groups are disliked more by liberals and conservatives. Like, liberals are more prejudiced against anti-abortionists, but conservatives are more prejudiced against civil rights leaders. Both groups are voluntarily joined political groups, but one fights for people's rights and the other seeks to take them away. The issue with the symmetrical prejudice view is that it prompts the question, is it wrong to be prejudiced against bad people who are hurting you? The answer is a pretty obvious yes. I'm not saying that absolutely every group liberals may be more prejudiced against is bad. What I'm saying is that it's silly not to pay attention to the nature of the groups involved. One of my professors had a really good argument against this approach. He asked, if a Jewish person hates a Nazi as much as a Nazi hates a Jew, should we treat that as equally prejudiced and equally bad? The incredibly obvious answer here is no. Also, even if we only look at antipathy between members of political parties, there is some indication that Republicans dislike Democrats more than Democrats dislike Republicans. According to a Pew Research study from 2022, about 6 in 10 Republicans, 62%, and more than half of Democrats, 54%, have a very unfavorable view of the other party. Now, part of the point of this video is arguing that there are darn good reasons to have a very unfavorable view of the Republican Party. However, even if we are ignoring everything substantive about the parties, these numbers are different, and that is worth noticing. Also, according to Pew, Republicans are more likely to see Democrats as inferior on a variety of traits, including honesty, morality, and laziness. Democrats are more likely to see Republicans as close-minded, but I'm not even sure all Republicans would object to that characterization. Plus, if we think of close-mindedness in terms of how they view marginalized groups, we have pretty solid evidence they are. For instance, white Republicans harbor more racial resentment than white Democrats. Racial resentment in this context means how much white people attribute racial disparities between Black people and white people to historical and societal forces versus a lack of hard work and perseverance by Black people. The divide between Republicans and Democrats has been growing here. A big part of that is white Democrats getting less racist, at least according to this measure. And I think any group of people getting less racist in any way is good, even if it technically contributes to polarization because it means that the spread between the parties is larger. Republicans seem to also hold more sexist attitudes, and this is true of both Republican men and Republican women. It was actually surprisingly difficult to find polling data that included sexist attitudes broken down by party, so I want to specifically highlight the work of the public opinion firm Perry Undum here. Here we see that Republicans are less likely to favor equality for women, especially regarding issues relating to power, and also just have some incredibly insulting views about women. If you want to know more about issues around sexism, including relating to the abortion issue, I have a playlist of videos about that. Perry Undum even have some questions about gender identity and homophobia as part of their survey, which means that I can highlight how Republicans are more homophobic and transphobic without having to find another source. And it is sometimes surprisingly difficult to find good sources with the blatantly obvious. Very few people out there itching to find results that make you say, well, duh. Although honestly, that research is incredibly necessary. We can also see here how sexism and racism interact by party, and that does not make Republicans look great either. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive look at the differences in prejudice by Democrats and Republicans. I was not even able to cover all prejudice against marginalized groups, but please do not think that those groups and their struggles matter any less. My only real goal here was merely to provide illustrative and data-based examples without making the video 6 hours long and insanely depressing. Instead, it'll just be pretty long and somewhat depressing. This video is deliberately not about policy, but I do think it is worth noting that the political parties in this country do have different political goals, and those goals are frequently shaped, especially on the right, by prejudice and false beliefs, like the ones I highlighted. So, how far policy suggestions are from some made-up center is not a good way to evaluate how reasonable they are. This is not a video about how the Democratic Party is perfect and the Republican Party is evil. It's a plea to pay attention to the substance of ideological tendencies, as well as what leads to those ideological tendencies, what their roots are, and if those roots make sense. It's a plea to not treat ideological tendencies as competing sports teams. Yes, through social identity, group membership can work similarly for both sports teams and political parties. I highlight that in my video on attitudes, but that does not change how fundamentally different the current largest ideological tendencies in the United States are. I am not arguing that polarization is good. I am arguing that a laser focus on reducing it can blind us to the bigger and more material issues. So, in closing, as an illustrative example, I want to talk about Henry Clay, the so-called Great Compromiser, who, if you are American, you might half remember from history class. Henry Clay was a congressman and then a senator from Kentucky, and is often taught about as a great statesman. What many consider to be his greatest achievement is the Compromise of 1850. We all like compromise, don't we? Reaching across the aisle, having a civil dialogue. Well, the Compromise of 1850 was about slavery and built on the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Maine to the Union as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, which was also Henry Clay's handiwork. The Compromise of 1850 did multiple things. It brought California into the Union as a free state, allowed New Mexico to decide the slavery issue internally, and in D.C. it allowed slavery to continue but outlawed the slave trade and enacted stricter fugitive slave laws. This is often credited with delaying the Civil War, but is that even good? Is that even worth it? Around 4 million people spent an extra decade in slavery, and more escaped slaves were forced back into slavery. That doesn't really seem worth it to me. Basically, the moral of this video is don't be Henry Clay. Compromise and reaching across the aisle can be great, but we need to always think about substance and consequences. We need to think about and explicitly talk about what we are compromising on. I can't provide a perfect guide on when to compromise and when to hold on to an ideal that seems extreme in your time, as abolition did in Clay's time. Yes, I do deeply admire John Brown. Instead, what I can suggest is not to treat the center as the ideal and not to assume that both ends of the political spectrum are equally unreasonable or evil or prejudiced or out of touch with reality. All right. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment, follow me on social media, that sort of thing. An extra special thank you to my patrons and to my editor and husband, Joseph, and to Michael Cohen at the University of Chicago, who helped me find some of my sources for the section on false beliefs. Bye!